Welcome, everyone. This is the fall webinar sponsored by ASA section on teaching statistics of the health sciences. And we're so glad that we could have you here with us today. Just to give you all a little bit of background, the section on teaching statistics in the health sciences is a section within the American Statistical Association, which is devoted to excellence in teaching statistics and conducting statistics education research, specifically within the health sciences. And our goal is to promote facilitation of communicating around these different activities among professionals who are interested in teaching statistics. Today, for our fall webinar, we have Dr. Amanda Ellis joining us today. She will be talking about methods for introducing the future of public health workforce to data analysis. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Kentucky, and she is vice chair for the Department of Biostatistics. And so we just want to welcome you all. And as you're going through this session, if you have more questions about the section on teaching statistics in the health sciences, I encourage you to go to our website. We have a lot of different resources for statistical educators. We regularly maintain a blog posting different activities regarding what's going on with our section, along with different resource reviews. And in addition, if you are teaching a class and you're having difficulty coming up with data sets to come up with real life examples for your courses, I urge you to join our section and look into our resources portal, which has a range of different data sets that you are free to use for our section members. So welcome everyone to the fall webinar. And Amanda, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jackie. All right, so as Jackie said, I'm going to talk about methods for introducing the future public health workforce to data analysis. And so just to start out with, I want to talk just a little bit about the motivation. So I was asked about 3 years ago to redesign a fully online introductory data analysis course for MPH students. This course serves MPH students that are both in our in-person program, but we also have a fully online program. And so since we have students in both programs and this course serves both of those, we wanted this course to be fully online. And we have about 45 students who enroll in this course a semester. So one of the reasons the course needed to be redesigned was a change in the Council on Education for Public Health evidence-based approaches to public health competencies, in particular the two competencies that this course is being used for are select quantitative data collection methods appropriate for a given public health context, and then analyze quantitative data using biostatistics, informatics, computer-based programming software as appropriate. So as you can see, these competencies, they're pretty broad. And so the next step was to actually go and speak with our public health partners and to see what they really needed from the workforce. And so the Kentucky Department of Public Health identified the following training needs that they really needed MPH students to have. They needed them to be able to work with statistical software, study and survey design, interviewing techniques, a strong understanding of descriptive measures, and the ability to effectively disseminate analysis and written communication. And so one of the things that we found while talking with our partners at the Public Health Department is that some of the things that are traditionally taught in introductory biostatistics, things like hypothesis testing, confidence intervals, they weren't mentioned in the conversation. They really wanted students to have this strong understanding of descriptive measures. And so when we developed this course, what we decided to do was put a strong focus on that piece and then lessen the focus on the more inferential methods, which is pretty different when you think of what a typical intro biostats course looks like. And then, of course, from the students aspect, students are becoming they are increasingly demonstrating this consumer-like behavior, and they're demanding even more value from higher education institutions. They want to know, what am I getting from this course? How is this going to help me in my future job? And so researchers argue that this consumer-like behavior shifts the common goal of higher education from mastering content knowledge towards gaining practical skills that align with future employment prospects. And so while developing this course, we wanted to, have students see how the content that they're learning in the course could be potentially used in their future employment. So in other words, help them make that connection between what they're learning and how they're going to use that content once they enter the workforce. And so I do want to pause. Every once in a while in this talk, I'm going to pause. I'd like to get some feedback from you all. So in the chat, I'm just curious, what are you all hearing in terms of your biostatistics courses? What are needs that you know that students want to take away from the course? Are you hearing anything about the things that they want to do in the workforce? What are you hearing from your partners out in the community? What skills do they want students to have? And then also, when you think about your accreditation, have you had thoughts about what those competencies are and how your intro data analysis course are meeting those competencies? So if you could take a minute in the chat, is there anything that you've been hearing? What are some of the needs that your intro data analysis courses need to meet? So Amy says, preparing students to read literature. And so Amy, I'll prod a little bit further. Are you hearing what types of literature? Are these just academic journals they want to be able to read? Are these reports that are put up by public health departments? What type of literature would we like students to be able to read and understand? Good, so students are looking more at data science skills, data cleaning, machine learning, medical literature. So in the research, we've got data literacy, being able to understand statistical results that they read. So good. So notice, two of these result around data literacy, seeking non-analytic jobs, wanting a wide range of data analytics, communicating with data, data management. Okay, so this, so we've got Chris Ryan just said, not currently teaching a course, but as a physician statistician working in a county health department, I wholeheartedly agree with what you heard from the public health practitioners in Kentucky. Descriptive statistics, especially graphs, are important. Software in R is very polarizing. I would agree with that. Having sound knowledge of statistical software. So as we can see from people, there's a variety of skills that students need to have. So we've got a lot of students seem to just want to make it through the course. They're nervous about the math and programming. Alicia, I could not agree with that more. I think that's a real hurdle that we work with. And, tying in for students how they're going to use that content in their job, I think does alleviate some of that. I just want to make it through the course. If we give them some understanding of how they're going to use this information in the future, it can, motivate them not just to make it through the course, but to hopefully retain some of that information. Okay, we want to scrutinize clinical trial publications. These are excellent. There's sometimes too much belief that software will give you the answer. I love that one. I think that is very true when it comes to students. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on here. I'm going to talk about the course that I developed, and I'll talk about the overall structure of it. I do want to say, someone else said, learn the practical application statistics rather than the statistical theory. All right. So my goals for developing this course were, I wanted to help students connect the course content to their future work. I also wanted to expose them to software applications. I wanted to provide an opportunity for collaborative work. I mean, most of us know that when you work in biostatistics, you're probably not going to work alone. So having those skills to work with other people are very important. And like I said earlier, I wanted to have a focus for this particular course on descriptive measures and on communication. So again, listening to what our partners at the public health department said, what I decided to do was to build this course around the idea of what they were calling an epidemiological report. And so this is a type of report that might come out of a public health department, usually summarizing some type of data. These are usually pretty colorful reports. They are primarily descriptive, although some of them do have confidence intervals in them. So for example, that one that you see there, place matters, health disparities in the Commonwealth, that one does do some inference in it, reports confidence intervals. And so, but this was a very real thing that I could see students creating once they were outside of the classroom. So I wanted to integrate this idea into the course. And so here in a minute, I'm going to talk about the course structure, and then I'm going to talk about how I basically embedded this idea into the course. And so as you're listening to how the course was developed, I'd like you to kind of think about how you can help students connect their course content to their future work. And so you'll see what I do with these EPI reports, but I think there are lots of different ways that we can brainstorm to help students connect coursework to what they might be doing in the future. All right, so I'm going to start out just with content delivery and assessment in the course. So again, fully online course, the LMS that my university uses, Canvas. There's nothing particularly special about Canvas and how I structure the course. This could also be done in Blackboard or really any of the other LMS systems. Course was divided into modules, and each module was 1 week of work. And so one of the things that I found that students really like is they like structure and consistent pace. And so each of the modules in the course were split into 4 sections. The first one was just an introduction, and this was usually a video of myself, very short, about 5 minutes long, just telling students what the primary goals for the week were, what they could expect for the week, and just kind of giving them that introduction. And then from there, I generally broke the content into 3 different sections. And so here's just an example of the first 2 modules for the course. If you were to click on any of these pages, so like the 1.1, 1.2, or like the 2.1, any of the ones that aren't the introduction, they would typically have a structure pretty similar to this. And so each of the pages would have the objectives up at the top. I think this is really important so students know right from the beginning what should be my main takeaways from this section of the work that I'm working on. There would be lectures, and there's a lecture video. I'll talk about this more in just a moment, an optional reading, and then the assignments would follow. And what you'll notice in the assignments, and I'm going to really dive into these, is that it seems like there's a lot of assignments, but some of these are very, very short. And then I also use discussion boards in the course for students to ask any questions that they might have. All right, so looking at the notes in the videos. So, I mean, at this point, many of us have created lecture videos. One thing that I do with all the lecture videos in the course, since there was only a recommended book, is I do have custom made notes. And so here's an example of what the notes would look like. And I don't have it on this page, but majority of the notes have a lot of fill in the blank pages or places so that students could fill in those notes while they watch the video. And so by the time they got done with the course, if they printed those, or let's say they filled those out on an iPad, they would have a really nice solid set of notes that were well organized. Again, if they filled them in while watching the video, that they could always go back and reference. So I've taught the course 3 times now. I haven't really settled on what supplementary textbook I like the most. These are 2 different textbooks that I've tried so far, and they were both fine, but I still think I could find a better one. Now, in terms of the assessments, after each of the lecture videos, I always started with a very short quiz. These typically take 5 minutes. They are super easy. They were basically just, did you watch the video? Did you not watch the video? The more interesting assessments that the students would have would be the worksheets. So one of the things that I really wanted to incorporate in the worksheet was a way to help the students make those connections to what they might be doing out in the workforce, or ways that they might encounter content or information in the real world. And so, for example, this worksheet right here, students were asked about interviewing techniques. Now, I could have went and found, a chapter in a textbook that talked about good interviewing techniques, but instead what I did was I found a YouTube video that was an actual training video for people that were going out in the field and how to conduct interviews. So students watched an actual training video. They could see that this was coming from a place that was doing actual public health research. They would watch that training video and then answer questions about interviewing techniques. I wanted students to, start to explore the world past the classroom when it comes to learning about content, and then also to try to learn that there's not always one right answer. And so I would use blogs to help do this. And so here's another example where a worksheet would ask students to compare 2 competing blogs. One where they talked about stacked bar plots are the worst, and another one that said, hey, these really aren't that bad. Sometimes we need to use these. So that they would get this understanding that just because they learn something in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean that's always the one and only right answer. And then I would also use discussions. And so discussion would be places where students would have to go find real life examples of different things. And so, for example, on this discussion board, I had this infographic that was talking about spotting bad science, and students would have to go out in the world and find real examples of bad science, post those to the discussion board, and then comment on each other's findings. And so I'll give you just a minute here. Hopefully you can read it. So this is an example of real discussions that took place. You can see this is 2020. So the first time that I taught this course was peak COVID, which always makes, made things interesting. But I'll give you a second to read this one, but you can see the type of interactions that students were having and making these discoveries for themselves. And so again, one of the things that I liked about discussions like this is it wasn't me presenting the graph and asking, okay, what's going on here? Maybe why is this poor? Why is this good? But it actually forced them to go and do that exploration on their own and find their own examples. And so, like I said, there were 45 students in the course. And so you can imagine on these discussion boards, they would get a really good selection of different examples, in this case, of bad science, and they could see what their peers had found and converse back and forth. So all of the ways that we've looked at so far were really what I would consider the more minor assignments in the course. These were typically easier ones, but even at this stage, you can see how the content delivery that I'm giving them, whether it be through a blog or it be through a training video that they watched, or it be through them going and finding things that they would look at in their everyday life, those were some ways that they could get content delivery that they might interact with in their future work. And so here's another, I just want to take a stop from me talking for just a minute. And if you all don't mind to write in the chat, what are some ways that you can think of that you could incorporate content delivery in your course that could potentially mirror how they would interact with content in their future work? And so like I said, so I've got blog posts and training videos, but what are some other things that you can think of that you could present or help students find that they could get content outside of the classroom? And then if you think of some, just go ahead and throw them in the chat. So we got sourcing our own data. I think that is a great one so that students can actually see what faculty are working with, that real data. We've got finding and reading articles from the medical literature in their field of specialization. Can anybody think of maybe some ways even outside of academia in their everyday lives that they might encounter some of this content? Newspaper, magazine articles, of course. Social media, I'm going to go ahead and throw that one in there as another one. For example, if you've ever been on Reddit, which is a huge website, there are several what are called subreddits. I actually make my students look for those as well, where they'll encounter different kinds of data visualizations. I love what Ann said here, comparing news articles about a clinical trial to the actual trial publication. I think that is an excellent comparison that students can make and really see for themselves that the takeaway that they might see in the news might not actually be the same takeaway that was made in the clinical trial itself. All right, so let's move on. And I want to get to what I really think is the meat of this course and what distinguishes it from some other courses that I've seen. And this is those EPI reports that I talked about at the very beginning of the course. And so like I was saying, we partner with our public health departments, and we said, what do you want your students to be able to do? And one of the things they came back with was to be able to write one of these. It's called an epi profile or an epidemiological report. It goes by several different names. And so what I decided to do was to structure this course around building one of these reports. And so from the very first day in the course, students learn about, well, what is an epi report? And so here's one of those worksheets that I talked about earlier. And in this particular worksheet, they would learn about these epi profiles or epi reports, and they would actually read the CDC's guideline on how to create an HIV epidemiological profile. And so I would give them several different examples of these reports and guidelines with the expectation of over the course of the semester, they would create one of these reports. And how I would have them create these reports is all the students would work with the BRFSS data, and I would assign each student, or students were given the opportunity to work in groups as well. I would assign them a different state. And so every group was given a different state with the exception of the state of Kentucky. And I'll talk about why nobody was assigned the state of Kentucky in just a little bit. And then the students would have to choose a topic that related to preventative healthcare. And so students might choose topics like breast cancer prevention, or there were other types of prevention. They might look at vaccines, for example, flu and pneumonia vaccines. So each of these groups would work with the BRFSS data. They would get a location and then a topic. And then how students would actually build the report is they would build the report in a series of drafts throughout the semester. And so the semester was structured so that students would learn some content, and then they would apply that content to write a report. They'd learn some more content, apply that content to write the next stage in the report. And this process would repeat until the end of the semester. So for example, if you look at this schedule for the course, each of the lines that are in orange, those are a different draft that they would write a piece of the report. And then everything in gray, those are weeks where they would be learning and building the content. And so you'll notice the beginning part of the course, this is when they would learn things about data collection, the importance of domain knowledge, how to write a research question. And then they would use that information to write the introduction to the report. Next, they would learn about how to summarize data, both categorical, quantitative data, primarily with graphs, but also with numeric summaries. And then they would use those skills to then build an infograph and then the main body of the report, which would be where they would really be using visualizations and different graphs to summarize the data. And then from there, they'd learn some inference, confidence intervals, and hypothesis test. And then they would have to incorporate both confidence intervals and hypothesis test in the report. And that would really go at the end of the report when they're summarizing their findings. And then finally, they would tie everything together and produce that final report at the very end. And one of the things that I really emphasize for students as they work through this process is that it was an iterative process. So for example, when they were writing their introduction, they obviously hadn't done their data analysis yet. So I would tell them, you may have to go back and revisit your introduction after you analyze your data some and you look at it. Now, to help students through this process, many of the worksheets were used to actually help build the reports. So for example, here I've got a set of a worksheet as well as the directions for one of the draft. And so you'll notice the worksheet here is on the left, and this is at the very beginning when they were working on their introduction draft. So here in this piece is where students were first trying to figure out what their topic was going to be and just learning about the reports. And so you'll notice in the worksheet here on the second page of the worksheet, students would have to go through the BRFSS data, which was the data set they were going to work with, and they would have to answer questions like, well, what is the BRFSS? What sampling design did it use? How was the data collected? What is data weighting and why is that important? So they would go through and they would answer all of these questions on the worksheet so that then when they would then go to work on the introduction draft for their report, they would have done all the background knowledge to actually write that draft. The other piece of this that was really important was that I gave the students opportunities to work as groups on the reports and the drafts, but all of the worksheets had to be completed individually. So even if a group of 3 was working on one of the report drafts, they would each complete their worksheets individually. So that way, when they came together, everyone had already done pre-work and everyone had something to contribute to the group. So it was well, not that it couldn't happen, but it was harder to have a group where you would really have just one person doing all the work because everybody would already have some work done. And so here's another example of this. So here we've got a worksheet on identifying quantitative variables. And students would have to go through the BRFSS and they'd have to look through the code book and identify 10 quantitative variables. And after each of them, they would have to give some information. Then they would go through and graphically summarize some of those quantitative variables, again, from the BRFSS. And you'll notice that I ask questions like how this variable relates to one of the research questions from your EPI profile. And so each of the students would do these worksheets by themselves. And so especially when it came to visualization or numeric summaries, each student individually built a pool of graphs and summaries for different variables. So that way, when they came together to work on the draft report, so in this one, they were working on the infographic, everybody had some plots that they could talk about. And there were a couple things that I really liked about this process. One, it would help students, let's say they messed up one of their graphs. They would catch it because they would see the graph that another student had created if they, happened to summarize the same variable. They would also see different stylistic choices. So maybe one student used a different title than they did, or slightly labeled their axes differently. So this way they could really talk to one another and figure out, okay, well, what do we think is the best way to label these graphs to summarize this data? They could also have conversations about what were the most important visualizations. Or which visualization did they like better? Maybe one of them summarized it using a box plot and one summarized it using a histogram. So they would have to have those conversations and compare their individual pools of plots and summaries before making final decisions about which ones were going to make the final cut and actually go into their infograph or later on into the report. So it mimicked more what I would consider realistic data analysis. It wasn't just, all right, create this one histogram, that one histogram goes in your report. They really did have to do some exploratory data analysis. So even though I don't explicitly call that here, that's really what they're doing individually and then coming together to put everything together at the end. Lost my mouse here. And so then again, just one more example. So here's a worksheet where they look at the importance of weighting, where they compare the distribution of different demographic variables for the BRFSS compared to what you see in the US Census. And so again, that would then go in their executive summary and appendix. Again, all the worksheets were completed individually, and then majority of students worked in groups to create the reports. Now for the code, students were actually given the option to use SAS or R in this course. And so this was a challenge from a teaching perspective, but how I set this up was, remember that I said none of the groups were given the state of Kentucky. So what I would do is for each time we learned a new concept, whether let's say it was visually summarizing quantitative variables, I would go through and give them the R code for the state of Kentucky. And so I would go through with the state of Kentucky using the BRFSS and show them how to create different plots using R for some different variables. And then I would do the exact same thing for SAS. So that way, when students would go to work with their own state's data set, they'd already seen what this looked like for the BRFSS. So what they would have to do is make decisions about how to alter that code to change it so that they were analyzing data for their state, as well as for the variables that they were interested in. So they already had some framework to work with the code, and they just had to go in and make changes. And so one thing that's important is this is an introductory course. There was no prerequisite in terms of, had you worked with software before? Had you had any statistics courses? They had none of that before. And then the option to use SAS or R, that's actually something that I'm evaluating right now. This came from our MPH committee. They wanted students to be able to have that option. So the students choose which one. Now, in terms of, our MPH students eventually go on to do a capstone. And so some conversations that I'm having right now are, do we really want the option here? Would it be better if we limit them to one or the other one? Should we open this up to more options? And then finally, feedback for the reports. Remember, I said that this was an iterative process. So how feedback worked for the course was I would provide video feedback on all of the drafts. So for example, when the students turned in their very first draft, what I would do on my computer is I would bring up that report on the screen. So you can see an example of that on the right. And then what I would do is as I went through the report, I have a surface, so I would mark with my pen on the screen, edits, changes that needed to be made. But then I would also talk through the video. One of the real benefits to this was it allowed me to insert basically little micro lectures into the feedback. So for example, students always, stumble when it comes to the language between what is a sample, what is a population. So when the students would get tripped up on that language, I could actually insert a little mini lecture right there and say, hey, this is why it's really important that we distinguish between these things. And this is what we should have here versus this, and this is why, and this is why it's important. And so the students would get these videos for each of the drafts that they turned in. And then also for each of the drafts that they turned in, they were expected to watch the video and make the changes based on the feedback, and then let me know what changes they had made. All right, so I've talked about this deliverable that students could potentially make while building, while learning the content. And so again, I'm going to pause for a second here. I'm going to ask you all in the chat, what are some other deliverables that students could build in an introductory data analysis course that they could build while learning the content? So again, I've got an epidemiological report here, but I think there are lots of good options here. So what are some things that you all can think of that could be a deliverable that a student could make that they could build while learning content? Jane, I think a poster is an excellent idea. We actually have an introductory undergraduate course that someone else teaches that they use the second half of the course to build those posters. Infographics, I think infographics are great. Table 1 for manuscripts. Any other deliverables that students can make? And we really want deliverables that they would be useful for them once they enter the workforce. Self-experimentation projects. I like that, and that gives some ownership to that because the students, are doing that experimentation, they're collecting that data. Press release. I love the idea of a press release. That's actually one, if I had more time in this course, I would love for them to do a press release of this report that they create in the course. So I think these are all really great suggestions. And I think we can expand past even written things. I think there are certain video opportunities that students could make. Maybe they could do an interview about a topic. But one of the things that I think is really important with the deliverables to help make this connection for students is if they can have something that they could take to a job interview. Because remember, these students are very focused on the workforce. They want to know how this is going to connect to their potential, their potential future jobs. And so the more deliverables that we can give or help students build, then they could then talk about that experience while they're interviewing, I think are really good. All right, so I want to show you some examples of student work. So I've talked about these reports that they're building. So what do these things actually look like when a student has built them? And so here is my first example. And I think, whenever I present this and I talk about this, it's like, okay, they're building these reports, but it isn't until we actually see what these look like by the end of it that we see the amount of work that students have put into it. And you can tell that they've put some ownership into this. And so here's one example. They looked at adult vaccine compliance in Georgia. So as you can see, their topic was vaccine compliance. They were in the state of Georgia, that's what they were given. And here we have their table of contents, their key findings, information about the BRFSS data, and then an example of one of their pages. Now, I'm not going to say that these are, the most perfect data analysis that I've ever seen, but I do think the students get a little more buy-in than they typically would if they were just, going through a textbook, doing online homework, things like that. Here's a second example. of student work. And I will say, so the first example, that was a student who opted to work by themselves. This one is an example of a group of 3. And so again, you'll see that the structure of this is very similar, very, very nice cover page, table of contents. We've got our infograph, introduction, and then again, the last page is from the body of the report where they've went through and they've summarized the different variables. And this group looked at breast cancer screening, and again, they had the state of Florida. And I will say, so the caliber of work that you see here, I would say probably a third to the half of the reports that I get are of this caliber. Now, I definitely get some that are not of this caliber, but I do get a good proportion of the students, you can tell, really take ownership of these reports. And these are something that they can talk about that they created during the course. All right, so let's talk about some feedback that I got from students. Did students like this process? So I asked the students which aspect of the course were most helpful and why. So this course was the most applicable course in my public health education so far. That's a pretty bold statement. And students tend to like this. They liked the fact that they were going through and actually creating something. And as you can see here, they felt like those worksheets, the things that they were using to build towards their reports, they had a purpose. They were doing something for a reason, not just, moving through the content. They really liked the application part. And so again, doing the analysis and then putting them together a report, having that end goal. It felt like, it prepared me for the workforce, which was really what my goal was. So here's a student, they were very nervous. And again, remember, this is a fully online course, but they really liked the structure of it, even though it was online. And so this is a student who was initially nervous, but they really liked it. And they liked that module setup. All right, so what aspects of the course would you change, how, and why? So this student thought the workload was a bit on the heavier side. They spent 8 to 10 hours a week on assignments. So one of the downside here is I don't think the average student spent this much time per week, but for a student that doesn't self-pace as well, or maybe works a little bit slower than other students, this can be a big undertaking for them, because there are a lot of assignments per week, even though many of those assignments are very short. So the amount of weekly work and grading system felt unbalanced. Some of the worksheets would take a matter of minutes. Other worksheets, particularly ones that involve coding, would take me 3 hours depending on the week, but all worksheets were only worth 10 points. And so this is a lesson learned for me. Overall, these 2 different types of worksheets were weighted differently in the final grade. And so they really were weighted differently, but students didn't see that. So I ended up structuring my grading a little bit different than in the iteration of this course after this student's comment. And then here this student said the report was a lot of work. So you'll see as a group, they spent 40 hours working on this project over the entire semester. And so again, the amount of work was one of the things that students primarily complained about. So I think they saw the utility of it. They appreciated they were creating something, but some of them recognize it was a lot of work to do that. All right, some lessons learned from this course. Students need help navigating an online course. And this is one of those things I don't think I took for granted, but this was like mid-pandemic. I'm like, okay, students are learning stuff online, they know how to navigate an online course. And I found that that's just not true. And so after I taught this the first time, the second and third iterations, I actually started including a video that was just, hey, this is an online course. This is how I suggest you navigate through this course. This is how I suggest that you partition your time for this course, how you approach this course. And that does seem to have helped some. Students need help with computing. This was one of the big ones. So what I found was that it wasn't so much that students struggled with the R or the SAS code. It was actually before that. I would have students that would download files from Canvas and then couldn't find them on their computer. They didn't know what folders were. They didn't know how to move them. And what would happen is that they would be having all of these struggles when it came to just finding files and moving files, that they would think the problem was with R or with SAS, But again, the problem was before that. And so again, after the first iteration of the course, I started including some additional tutorials on both a Mac and a Windows machine that was just like, okay, this is where we can create a folder. This is where your files are. This is so you can find them, so that, you know, it would make working with R and SAS easier. Consistent due dates. This is a big one. So I did this from the get-go, but I did find that students really appreciated this. So all of the work took place in not all of the work, but each week has its own set module, and there was a single due date for all work. And so work was always due on Sunday or Monday, for example. So that way students just always knew. There was never any guessing. They knew due dates for this course are always on this one day of the week. And for the most part, students seem to really appreciate that because it completely took the guesswork or the memorization out of when is stuff due. They just always knew it was due on a single day of the week. And it seems like a really small thing, but I think students really appreciated it. I've had several students comment that they really liked it. I've only ever had one student comment that they didn't like it. And their rationale for not liking it was, I'm not good at time management. I need someone else to manage my time for me, which I thought was kind of funny. But so those were some lessons learned from it. And then the last one here is that individual work before group work. To me, this was a crucial piece. I really like that students get to collaborate with one another, that they get to work with each other and experience that. But group work can be really tricky. And getting students to work together as a group, but not having that group dynamic where one person or two people are doing all the work and we've got one person that's not carrying their weight, it really breaks down group work and students hate that. And so by having students do individual work before the group work, I think alleviated a lot of that concern, because students do the individual work because they want their grade and they know that grade depends on them alone. So then by the time they got to the group work, everybody had something to contribute. So that's not to say I've never had trouble with groups, but for the most part, I get very few group complaints. And I actually had one student, it wasn't the last time I taught it, it was the time before. She had emailed me that particular semester. I had actually forced them to be in groups. And she had emailed me before the semester started and said, please don't make me work in a group. I was like, she said, I hate working in group work. It has never worked well for me. Please don't make me do this. And so I emailed her back and I said, well, this semester I'm requiring you to work in a group. If you end up having any trouble with your group, please let me know and we'll, sort it out then. And I didn't hear from her until the end of the semester. I got an email from her and she said, this is the best experience I have ever had working in a group. I absolutely loved it. Everybody contributed. She said, this was such a valuable experience. And so even students that are initially hesitant with group work, I think they really appreciate this. And for the most part, it works out really well. All right, so the last thing that I want to show you, I actually just found this out 2-3 weeks ago. And I cannot tell you how happy this made me. So I've taught this course 3 times. And one of the students who was in the first iteration of this course, I found out she works for the March of Dimes, and just as part of her job, created the report that you see right here. And she's a second author on this report. So I can now actually go back to my students and say, hey, these reports that you're creating or you're learning to create in this course, here is somebody that took this course, graduated from your program, and this is something that they just made in their current job. So they can actually see now, hey, she's not just making this up. This is a real potential. I could go into the workforce and create something like this. And so, like I said, I just found this out like 2-3 weeks ago. She's second author on this paper or on this report. And I was just super excited because, as you can see visually, very similar to the things that they created in the course. All right, so I'm going to stop here, just say thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you might have about this course. Yeah, so that's a really good question. What proportion of your students choose SAS? I'd say it's about a third. So I probably have 2/3 choose R and a third use SAS. And I will say this is something I'm working with our Masters of Public Health committee right now. It's hard. Students take this course in their first year of their MPH. I give them the option to use SAS or R, but I don't know that students really know enough to make that decision for themselves, because at that point in their coursework, they haven't chosen their capstone committee yet. They don't know what their capstone advisor, what software they're comfortable with. So I do feel like it's a little bit of a hard ask for students to say, which one do you want to pick? But I can't make that choice for them either. So I've reached out to our capstone, our MPH committee, to ask them to help me help students make that decision, if that makes sense. But right now, I'd say about a third of them use SAS and 2/3 use R. Yeah, so what software they tend to use in their final project? Same answer. R about 2/3 of the time, SAS about a third of the time. So this is a terminal course for our MPH program. We do not have a biostats concentration. So I know a lot of MPH programs have a biostats concentration, so their students probably go a little bit further, but this really is a terminal course for our MPH. The exception to that is we will have some students that will go on. I actually teach an intro to R programming course. Some of our students after this course will go on to take that course because they're intrigued and they want to learn more about R programming. We also offer an intro to SAS that some of them will go on to take. But for many of the students, this is the only biostats course they take. I'm trying to keep up in the chat, so if I miss something, I apologize. So I do cap the group size at 3. I think after you get past 3, you're more likely to have that person that probably isn't pulling their weight. So I cap it at 3, but I allow them to work individually or in pairs. And I go back and forth on this. There was, like I said, I've taught 3 times. There was one semester that I told them you have to have a group of 3. With the exception of the course size didn't divide evenly or exactly into groups of 3. So I think there were 2 groups of 2 at the end. That semester worked really well. But one of the things that I do whenever I tell them that they have to form groups, or I highly encourage them to form groups, is I do create a discussion board. And what I ask them to do is I say, okay, if you want to work in a group, post to this discussion board and answer these questions honestly. And I ask them things like, do you like to procrastinate? When do you typically like to work? Do you work during the day? Do you work in the evening? Do you work on the weekend? So I ask them some questions like that. And I ask them to answer those questions as honestly as they can so that they can hopefully find group members that have similar work habits to them. And I think that also helps alleviate some of the conflict that can happen within groups. Because you can imagine if you've got somebody that wants to have everything done early and somebody that procrastinates, that's not going to mesh well. But I think if they're upfront about that and say, hey, I tend to work pretty late, and you get somebody else that does, you're more likely to work better in a group. So 45 students in the course, they're all in one section. So that is one section. And I will say, probably for me, when I teach this, the hardest part with 45 students is the video grading. The video grading on the weeks that I do that is a large chunk of my time on those weeks. It is a bit of a labor of love. I really do feel like it's beneficial for the students. So I do it because I think it's good and I want to do it, but it is a lot. How many courses are you supposed to teach a semester? So personally, I'm in a little bit of a different position. I'm in a special title series position. So I do, my DOE is about 75% teaching, 75%. So I teach 7 courses a year, give or take if I have teaching release. So I teach 3 or 2 courses most semesters. So like this semester, I'm teaching 3. The semester that I teach this course, I teach 2 courses, but only one of them is the one that you saw here. Did I miss any questions? What happened to
Amanda, there was a question a while back about what kind of software they used for the layout and the text.
Oh yeah, so that's up to them. Most of them do it in Word. I also one of the things that I suggest they do for the cover page is that they use Canva, and then I show them, if you use Canva, here's how you can save this as an image and put it into Word. But majority of them use Word for these. Oh, so this is a great question from Donna at the end that I didn't talk about. So it says, do you give them appropriate SAS or R code to obtain estimated standard errors? Is it clear that you tell them the weighting is important? Okay, so this is a great question, Donna. I don't actually have them weight the data. And so there's two reasons for this. One, given the level that this course is at, I think data weighting is a little bit advanced. So I actually have them do all of the summaries and everything without data weighting. And you might say, oh, well, that sounds terrible. But the positive to this is when they talk about in their introduction and their executive summary for these reports, I make them include a limitation section. And in that limitation section, I make them talk about how a limitation of their report is that they didn't do data weighting and why that piece is important. And one reason I really like having that, or having the students do that in these reports, is that I think a lot of these students are just really scared that they're not going to do a perfect analysis. And they don't realize that no matter what data analysis we do, there are always going to be limitations, and we need to just acknowledge and be honest about those limitations. So by being very transparent that that is a limitation in their analysis, I think it helps them understand that, oh, there might be other limitations in analyses, and we just need to talk about them. That's okay. We need to report them and be honest about them. And I think it alleviates some of that misconception or anxiety they have about those things. So I don't have them, again, I don't have them actually do the data weighting, but I don't feel bad about it because I make them talk about it in the limitation of the report. And that was one of those worksheets you saw where they actually compared the summaries of some of those demographic variables to the census. It really helps them see why weighting is important and then why it's a limitation that they don't do it. Yeah, so if the number of students doubled or tripled, so these are nightmares that I have. I don't know what I would do. I would have to rethink some of the stuff that I do in this course if the number of students were to double or triple. I would still like to keep, you know, the ideas of the course the same, but there would be some things that I would have to change. One of the things I've thought about doing is incorporating some peer evaluation into the drafts. That would take some of the workload off of me, but I have to be very careful about how to set up those peer evaluations. But I think those could also be really valuable for students. Do I have TA support to conduct lab sessions? So this is fully online. So there are no lab sessions. We never meet synchronously as a course. This course, it's fully online, asynchronous. Now I do have TA support to help me with grading. They will grade a lot of those worksheets. Some of that stuff that's easier to grade that I can actually write a key for. The reports though, there's no way a TA could grade those. Those are all on me. Any other questions or questions that I missed? Well, if not, I'll say thank you all so much. I know we're getting close to time. Jackie, I'll go ahead and I'll move on to the last slide here. Maybe.
Hi, so thank you so much, Dr. Ellis, for a great presentation. I really appreciate the time that you took to pull everything together. I think we all learned a lot from it. And I just want to thank everybody, our audience, for attending the TSHS webinar. And then again, if you're interested in becoming more involved, you can see information for our site posted here. And this webinar has been recorded. And as soon as the recording is available, we will post it as well. If you are interested in becoming more involved in our section, again, please reach out to our website here, contact us. We'd love to have more active members. And if you aren't already a member, again, please visit our site, see the resources that we have available, and consider joining. We have a lot of information about our blog, about different resources that we have available for teaching statistics in the health sciences. And if you're interested in real world biomedical data sets, again, I highly recommend looking into our portal. Thank you all so much for taking the time out to come to our webinar. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Thank you, guys.